All right, in our third set of guided notes, the third of 5, we're going to look at species interactions. A community includes all the species that interact within an ecosystem. Recall from our first set of guided notes, there are 4 different levels at which we look at things. There's the individual, that is one organism living within an ecosystem. There is a population. The population is all the members of a single species that lives within an ecosystem. Then you come to community. The community is every individual of every species, every living thing, plant and animal that live within an ecosystem. When you combine the biotic and abiotic factors together, that's when you get to the ecosystem. So we're at the point where we're talking about everything that lives in the ecosystem: animal, plant, fungus, bacteria, protist, and so on. All of these different species that are living within an ecosystem will interact with each other, and they interact in different ways. We often describe a species niche within an ecosystem. The niche helps us understand the way that these species are going to interact with each other. The niche includes the resources within that ecosystem that the species consumes and their role they play within that ecosystem: primary producer, primary consumer, etc. The niche will include where the organism lives, the actual location where it carries out its life. What it eats. Is it a primary consumer? Is it a primary producer? Is it a tertiary consumer? What are you eating in that ecosystem? That is part of the niche. How and when that organism reproduces, and what organisms it will interact with on a regular basis. This is all very important stuff because when the niche of 2 different species overlaps, in other words, they live in the same place, they eat the same thing, they reproduce at the same time. Whenever the niche of 2 species overlaps, you're going to get a species interaction. Tolerance describes a species' ability to survive and reproduce under changing conditions. So when things in the ecosystem start to change, how good is that organism at dealing with those changes? That's what tolerance is. Organisms will fall into 1 of 2 categories: specialist or generalist, and which one they are determines how tolerant they are. A specialist is a species that has a very narrow niche. In other words, they only eat a few things, they only live in very specific places, they only reproduce at a very specific time, they need a very specific place in order to reproduce. There's something about their niche that is very restrictive. This means if that part of their niche overlaps with another organism, it's going to be hard for them to tolerate that. They're not going to be able to deal with that very well. Good example of a specialist is a panda bear. A panda bear's diet is almost exclusively bamboo. So if something happens to the bamboo, the panda bear can't adjust. We have to understand that humans are pretty unique. If we walk to the cabinet and we want to eat some Takis and there are no Takis there, we see a bag of potato chips next to it and go, potato chips will do. We grab that and we eat it instead. We're not specialists like a panda bear is. Panda bears eat bamboo. And if there's no bamboo, they don't eat. That's that. They're specialists. So if the bamboo disappears, the pandas won't eat anything and the panda bears will starve. They can't tolerate changes to their environment. We humans are generalists. We have very wide niches. We can eat a lot of different things. We can live in a lot of different places. Our niche is not very restrictive. So if something happens to one thing, we just do something else. We don't have Takis to eat, we eat potato chips. Don't have potato chips to eat, we grab an apple. We can consume many different things and we can live in many different places. So we have a good tolerance compared to something like a panda bear. When these overlaps occur, we get competition. So if another organism moves into the area where the panda bear lives and that other organism eats bamboo as well, there's going to be competition between that other new organism and the panda bear. The competition can be direct or indirect. Direct competition is between 2 individuals. So again, in that hierarchy, we're talking about single organisms. So two bucks fighting over a mate, that is direct competition. These are two individuals, two single organisms fighting over one resource, a doe to mate with. Indirect is more general, and it will involve populations, whole groups within a species, all the members of a species. So it's a lot bigger kind of competition, but at the same time, it's much more general competition. For example, you might have two species of flowering plants that need the honeybees to pollinate it. These plants are going to be competing over the available honeybees. They need the same resource. And it's not just one flowering plant, it's all of them. It's every member of that species having to compete for those same honeybees. It's a much bigger type of competition, but it also involves a large number of individuals. It's not just between two things. Competition can be interspecific. Whenever you see the prefix inter, it means within. This is competition within a species, or between. Inter means between. My fault. I'm thinking ahead. Inter means between. So when you see interspecific, that means it means between two species. The flower pollinator example. It's two different species of flowering plants competing with each other. It's between two species. Intra means within. Intra means within one species. The competition happens, but it only involves a single species. This is more like the buck example. It's two species, it's two individuals from the same species of deer that are competing with each other. I told students in class to think about the internet versus the intranet. The internet is communication between two different computer systems. It's your home network computers communicating with some outside server system, some outside set of computers. There are two computer systems communicating with each other. That is the internet between two systems. Intranet is your home network. It's everything within your home communicating with each other. Intra means within, inter means between. Competitive exclusion happens when two or more species try to occupy the exact same niche. Again, their niches overlap. And that can lead to something called competitive exclusion, where one species tries to push the other species out. Now, typically, neither species will fully exclude the other. Typically, the one species will not completely kick the other species out. Most oftentimes, something will happen that will allow these organisms to live together. The organisms can adjust by changing their behavior. For example, let's assume that we have organisms that hunt in the same area and they hunt the same thing. Two bird species, for example, live in the same area and they both hunt mice. They're going to be in competition over the mice. Now, these two bird species might not get into a situation where one kicks the other bird out completely, but they might find a way of changing their behavior in which they can adapt, where one bird, for example, will hunt during the daytime. The other bird will hunt at night. Hawks and owls. Hawks and owls compete for the same food source. They both eat mice. But because the hawk hunts during the day and the owl hunts at night, they never hunt for the same mouse. They're never hunting the same individual. They will feed off the same resource. They will feed off the same population, but their competition is reduced by when they hunt. So they never directly compete with each other because they never hunt at the same time. Species can also adjust by utilizing only a portion of the shared resource. So, for example, let's say we're talking about breeding sites. Birds, as you know, tend to build nests in trees. So there's competition for trees amongst different species of birds, but that competition never results in only one species of bird living in an area. This is because the birds will only use the trees they need. It's not like bluebirds will go and build nests on every single branch and every single tree in the woods. They will only build one nest on one branch in one tree. So that leaves all the other branches and all the other trees available for other birds of other species. Hoarding is a human thing. Collecting is a human thing. It's only our human complex brains that get this drive to get every single one of every single thing. Animals don't do that. They tend to take what they need and they leave the rest for other species. And in doing so, that reduces the competitive interactions between them. Competition can be reduced by reducing niches. The natural niche for an organism is called its fundamental niche. So if you consider every place that an organism could live, every food source that an organism could eat, every place that an organism can breed, you're looking at their fundamental niche. It's all the possibilities. But that fundamental niche can be reduced into something called a realized niche in order to reduce the competition and allow for two species to exist within the same niche. The example we're going to talk about are barnacles. We have a certain type of barnacle here. It's brown in color. It can live everywhere between the low tide mark and the high tide mark. This area is its fundamental niche. It can live anywhere in this zone and be perfectly fine. But let's say a second barnacle species moves in that lives in the same general area. Now there's going to be competition. So now we have a second species that's been introduced, this blue one. But let's say this blue one can't live in the entire area. Its upper zone is somewhere around here in the middle mark. Well, what could end up happening is instead of this brown barnacle living in its entire range, it ends up just living in the top part, where the blue barnacle can't. This is a realized niche. The fundamental niche was the entire zone. The realized niche is where it actually gets to live. But by living there, both species can coexist and not one of them end up being excluded from that area. This is called niche reduction. A fundamental niche is turned into a realized niche, allowing both organisms to coexist. Competition finally reached the result of resource partitioning. In resource partitioning, an organism becomes specialized to use only a portion of the given resource. We're going to talk about birds feeding on seeds. So let's say we have two species of birds that eat the same seed from the same plant. One may become specialized at eating the larger seeds, while the other becomes specialized as eating the smaller seeds. They're going to still eat the seeds from the same tree, but they're going to divide those seeds up by size. One species eats the big seeds, the other species eats the little seeds. This is resource partitioning. They divide up the one resource that they have. This can in turn lead to character displacement. Character displacement is when the actual physical characteristics of the organism begin to change. They actually start to look different because of these specialties they develop. For example, if they're eating the larger seeds, a larger beak would be beneficial. So over time, over generations, the large beak becomes the dominant feature that you see in that species. The ones that eat the small seeds are going to be benefited by smaller beaks. So again, over time in several generations, you may see these birds develop smaller and smaller beaks until eventually these two species of birds begin to look very different from each other, even though they're feeding on the same resource. Invasive species are a type of species interaction. This is when a non-native species spreads into a community. You introduce something that's not normally there. This new species tends not to have any limiting factors within this new ecosystem. There's nothing that's going to limit their growth. This could be because they utilize a resource that nothing else in the ecosystem is using, and as a result have no competition over that resource. This could be because they have no natural consumers or predators within that ecosystem, so there's nothing in there that puts pressure on them. This lack of competition, this lack of pressure allows them to grow and reproduce very quickly, and they easily outcompete the native species for resources. The example I'll talk about here is one that you've probably seen before in your life, and that is kudzu. Kudzu is an invasive species. It was planted here to prevent erosion back when the highways were being built. They were clearing a lot of land to make room for big equipment, to make room for the roads. There was a lot of exposed dirt, and where there's a lot of exposed dirt, there's a lot of erosion. So they got the idea of bringing in this Japanese plant called kudzu that grows very quickly, makes thick roots, makes thick vegetation, keeps the soil from getting eroded. The problem is there are no primary consumers here that eat kudzu. It's not a native plant. So the primary consumers that live here have no idea that they could eat kudzu. So they don't. And that kudzu has no pressure on it. As a result, it grows very quickly outcompeting the native plants for space and sunlight until you end up with situations like this where there's nothing but kudzu left in the ecosystem. And this would literally destroy the ecosystem because there's nothing there that consumes the kudzu, so you lose your primary consumers. You lose your primary consumers, you lose everything else above them on the food chain. Invasive species are a bad thing. Symbiosis describes species interactions. It's when an interaction between two species benefits at least one of them. There are three types of symbiosis based on what happens to the other. So again, in a symbiosis, one species will always be benefited. The three types of symbiosis are based on what happens to that second species. If that second species is harmed, we call it parasitism. Parasitism is when one species benefits, the other one is harmed. It's a plus-minus relationship. Tapeworms are parasites. They infect mammals like dogs, and they benefit by taking the nutrients away from the food that the dog eats. They live there in the intestines. This is what they look like. And they just suck up the nutrients from all the food the dog eats. The dog is hurt by this because the dog doesn't get the nutrients it needs to survive, and it will begin to waste away. And even though it's eating, it will begin to starve. You can tell if your dog has tapeworms because if you look at its feces, you'll see little wiggling white bits in it. The little wiggling white bits are segments from this worm that carry the eggs. If you ever see this in your dog's feces, you need to get your dog dewormed. Mutualism is a relationship that benefits both species. So it's a plus-plus relationship. And the example I'll give you here is the nitrogen-fixing bacteria that live on the roots of soybean plants. It is a mutualistic relationship between the soybean plant and the bacteria. The bacteria benefit by receiving the food they need, the sugars they need from the plants. They actually tap into the soybean and they receive sugars from the soybean. That's a plus. They get their food. The plant benefits because they receive the nitrogen compounds that they need to grow from the bacteria. And remember, these bacteria will take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and make ammonia with it, and then other bacteria in the soil will turn the ammonia into nitrate ions. Nitrogen cycle from the previous unit. In these little nodules, these little white clumps that you see on the root of the soybean plant, these bacteria are living and growing. And again, they are tapped into the plant to receive their sugar. The plant, in return, receives the nitrogen compounds that it needs to grow. Both organisms benefit, so it is a mutualistic relationship. The final type of relationship is called commensalism. This is where one species benefits, the other one is unaffected. It's not harmed by the interaction. It's not helped by the interaction. We consider this a +0 relationship. Sharks and remoras have a commensal relationship. The remora benefits from eating the scraps left from the shark when it feeds. So when it grabs a fish and tears it to bits, there are scraps of meat that end up in the water. The remora eats that to its benefit. The shark is not affected. There is no benefit to the shark. There is no harm to the shark. It's a 0 relationship. That's what makes it commensalism. The final section of this notes will talk about predation and herbivory and how they impact the other species in an ecosystem, how the species interact when predation and herbivory happen. Predation is when one individual from one species hunts and kills another individual from another species. Like a wolf tracking down a rabbit in the woods. The wolf is the predator, is the one that's doing the hunting. The rabbit is the prey, it's the one that does the eating. Now, obviously, this is going to have impacts on the populations of these organisms. And we talked a little bit about this when we did negative feedback loops in our very first unit. When there's a lot of rabbits around, there can be a lot of predators. A large number of prey support a large number of predators. But as that predator population gets larger and larger, the prey population will get smaller and smaller. So eventually the prey population will crash. And when the prey population crashes, the predators start to starve and their population crashes as well. With the predators gone, then the prey can grow again. When the prey grow again, the predators grow again. When the predators grow again, they crash. It constantly cycles. We're going to talk about this again in the next set of guided notes. We talk about ecosystems that are in equilibrium, ecosystems that are homeostasis. These negative feedback loops like this are what helps drive that homeostasis that we see in these stable ecosystems. Herbivory happens when an animal feeds on plants. When an animal feeds on a plant, it can kill the plant, it can limit that plant's ability to grow and reproduce. It's basically bad for the plant. How do the plants respond to that? They respond by growing defensive mechanisms. Over time and generations in natural selection, evolution, plants have developed thorns and spines to make themselves painful to eat. I mean, blackberries have it figured out. They're covered with thorns. So animals don't eat the leaves and stems of blackberry plants. But at the same time, they produce nice, sweet fruit that birds love. So they've kind of manipulated the bird population to eat the fruit. And when they do that, they can't digest the seeds, so they carry the seeds off somewhere else and distribute the seeds for the blackberry plant. Mother Nature is an amazing thing. The blackberry has developed defensive structures to keep animals from eating the stems and leaves, but at the same time developed sweet fruit to entice the animals to eat the fruit and distribute their seeds for them. We think about evolution, we think about things changing to their environments. We don't think about plants doing it, but they do. They do it quite often. Plants have also developed toxins that they will have in their stems, leaves, and fruits to prevent animals from eating them. I mean, an animal only has to eat a poisonous fruit one time and get sick from it, never to eat it again, humans included. They learn not to eat these plants, that develop a behavior of not eating these plants, and these plants can then grow and survive and thrive because the animals have stopped eating them. That ends this set of guided notes. In the next and fourth one, we'll talk about ecosystems that change and the process of succession.